We're here for Dr. Gregory Sadler, who is an expert on the Stoics. My students have read for this, in preparation, the Stoic Catechism readings from our text, but that's just background. And Gregory Sadler is not only an expert in the Stoics, but he's also a PhD in philosophy. He and I went to grad school together, so every time he comes, we reminisce about those days. And he's an expert in the history of philosophy, but more particularly in using the Stoics, I think, as a way to get contemporary folks connected with philosophy and also sort of therapeutically to help them through various issues in their life. And so making philosophy relevant to real life. There's an idea, right?
Yeah.
So that's he's also got a very wide and large online presence, including a recent visit to London, Stoicon. Is that what it was?
That's right, yeah.
There's such a thing as a Stoicon, can you believe that? And then that's on video. You can actually watch the lecture or the talk you gave for that online. And there's myriad other things like tutorials in philosophy across the internet. So there's I could say a bunch more, but I'd rather give time for Greg Sadler. Let's welcome him talking about Stoics.
All right. Well, thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks to the Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship as well. I set this up so it could be a useful introductory lecture for both intro to philosophy class, those who read the Stoic Catechism, which is largely drawn from Epictetus Enchiridion, one of the really key texts in Stoic philosophy, but also would have some relevance for the business ethics students, some things about leadership and entrepreneurship. Really the things that Stoicism has to offer are of use to people across the spectrum. So Stoicism is an ancient philosophical system that it's not one of the very first ones, but it becomes one of the most important philosophical schools of ancient times. It continues to influence and affect people in the West all the way down to the present, at some times in a covert way, at other times in a very overt way. And in the last 20 or so years, we've seen a renaissance in interest in Stoicism, to the point that the military is using it for training soldiers in how to become more resilient. Entrepreneurs and tech types are using it for productivity. Other people are using it for self-help. People who are interested in cognitive approaches in psychotherapy are studying it. But you can also go back to the actual text, which as a philosopher I think is very important. So we can talk if you want, and I've reserved some time for Q&A. We can talk about why it's catching on and why it's of interest a little bit later. Today I want to zero in on certain aspects of it. And since you've got this reading, and if you don't have it in front of you, it's very easy to get. You can find it online. Epictetus Enchiridion literally means the book you can stick in your hand. It's a set of very short chapters. It's also a very good Stoic text to begin with. I'm going to focus primarily on that, and I'm going to use Epictetus and his text as sort of a lens to provide some Stoic lessons that I think could be useful for you, whether you're going into business, whether you're trying to manage your life as a busy student, probably also working as well, managing family life, stress, all of that sort of stuff. So what I wanted to do, since we have a really short time here, is give you a really brief overview of the Stoic School. So again, each one of these points we could spend an entire class session on any one of them and expand it. We can do that in the Q&A to a limited extent. So I'll talk about how the Stoics got started, what some of their key ideas were, and then how they get down to this guy Epictetus, who's one of their very late Stoics, and why he's important, and a little bit about his life. And then I want to jump right into the material. And the key idea that I want this to center around, that I think is of great use, particularly in business contexts, is that of self-governance or self-mastery. Why that? If you want to be a leader, you cannot be a leader not only if you can't follow, but if you can't manage your own life. And we see over and over again entire corporations fail because the company leadership can't keep things together in the way that they ought to. They can't manage their own life. So Stoicism is not a sort of fix-everything approach to this, but it does provide a lot of useful perspectives and practices. And there's 4 main other topics that I thought we could go into. One is called the dichotomy of control. Some of you may be familiar with this already. It's not only the Stoics who talk about this, the Serenity Prayer. Any of you familiar with that? The Serenity Prayer, that talks about it a little bit. Prices and priorities, how we make decisions. What Stoics call impressions or appearances and the judgments that follow from them, and then our emotions and our affects and attachments. These are not the whole of Stoic philosophy, and these aren't even everything that's covered in the Enchiridion. So if you've got questions, if you read the text and you're like, hey, I want to talk about this, after we get through all of this material, go ahead and ask about it. And by the way, if you have questions or if something's unclear, go ahead and interrupt me. I don't have a problem with that. You're not going to knock me off track. I've been doing this public speaking stuff for about 20 years, and sometimes it's good to dwell on things, and I even built in a little bit of time for that, anticipating that. So, all right, so first thing to talk about, the Stoics. Who were these guys? And they weren't all guys, too. There were some female Stoic philosophers. Unfortunately, we don't have any of their writings, but we know that they existed. For example, the daughter of Cato was a philosopher. They get started with this guy Zeno of Citium, who is not from Athens originally. He's from this colony, and he comes in with a shipload of purple dye, which was extremely expensive, a luxury product, and he's shipwrecked. He gets to literally see his fortune floating away in the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea. And he winds up on shore in Athens, down on his luck. We don't know whether he had any other resources. And he goes to a book stall. Now, books at that time were scrolls. You'd actually have to unroll it and then look at it that way, so it wasn't like paging through it. And he's reading about this guy Socrates, who I think you've encountered in your philosophy classes before, right? Socrates impressed people by his character. And the book that he's reading is by Xenophon, who is not, Plato. Plato is the main person that we know about Socrates through. Xenophon portrays this fairly heroic, tough guy, Socrates. And Zeno's, thinking, how can I be like this? Where can I find somebody like this? And the bookseller says, well, you see that guy over there? That's Crates, the Cynic philosopher. Go check him out. And he does so, and he studies with him for about 10 years. Studying meant not just like showing up to lectures or completing assignments. It meant actually living with the person and trying to think of life through their eyes, trying to, you might say, assimilate yourself to their perspective on the world, and learning from their example. If you had a teacher who wasn't really up to par, if they didn't walk the walk, but they talked the talk, you could figure that out pretty quickly by living with them. And the fact that Zeno stuck with Crates for 10 years tells you that Crates was really, he was serious about this. He also studied with some other philosophers, so he's getting an influx from other Socratic schools. He studied at the Academy with Stilpo, and he studied with Polemo as well. And so he's drawing all this stuff together, and he brings it together in a synthesis that he doesn't actually call Stoicism at first. Who here knows what Stoicism was named after? It wasn't named after Zeno. As a matter of fact, his early followers were just called Zenonians. Would any of you want to be a Zenoniist?
I should bring that back.
Yeah. Where did the Stoics get their name from? Does anyone know? Sort of a trivia question. No? It comes from a place, the Stoa Poikile, the Painted Porch. These people literally hung out on the porch and talked philosophy, talked about their problems, tried to figure out how to live their life. And so they became known as the people of the Stoa. And eventually it draws more and more people. Already in Zeno's own lifetime, he's got people who are leaders after him. The King of Macedon, which at that time hadn't taken over the Greek world, but was getting close, asked Zeno to come up and teach him. Zeno sends one of his students, and we know this because there's an actually existing letter preserved in Diogenes Laertes that narrates this. So already it's getting a lot of play, you could say. But it's centered in Athens. And then there's followers coming after that. This guy Cleanthes, who was a boxer and a water carrier. He was a reliable kind of guy, didn't make a lot of innovations. And then there's the third scholar, Chrysippus, who's known as the second founder of the Stoa. Because by then, and this may be something that you have some experience with, the different philosophical schools were routinely arguing with each other about everything, attacking each other, criticizing each other. And Chrysippus was sort of a champion of Stoicism. And then we have other guys coming after him, and I'm going to jump over about 200, 300 years of history. Eventually, Stoicism leaves Athens itself and spreads throughout the entire Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking world, the Roman Empire. And this is where we get to what we call the late Stoa. These are the people that we actually have texts from. Unfortunately, we don't have texts from Zeno. He wrote a lot of stuff, all of it's gone. And we could talk more about that later. The people that we do have texts from are from the later time. We have Seneca. Who here has heard of, not the city Seneca or the train line or anything like that, but the actual person Seneca? Anybody? He's worth reading. Musonius Rufus, you probably, if you haven't heard of Seneca, you haven't heard of him. He was Epictetus' teacher. Epictetus himself, you know about him because you've read him. And then who here has heard of Marcus Aurelius? Anybody seen Gladiator, the movie? He was the emperor at the time, one of the last good ones, as they were called. There were only like 5 or 6 good emperors for the whole Roman Empire, acknowledged as good ones. He was one of the good ones. He was a Stoic philosopher. And Epictetus is sort of at the heart of this. Epictetus himself didn't write down the document that you're looking at. He had a student who did that. And the student was modeling himself after Xenophon. Socrates never wrote anything down either. Instead, his students wrote it down, Plato, Xenophon, a few other people. This guy, his name was Arrian, he wrote down a lot of the dialogues and discourses and teachings that Epictetus had in a big, thick book that's called the Discourses, the diatribai. Literally, in Greek, the things you say to pass the time. And then he condensed them into this tiny little document called the Enchiridion. And the Enchiridion means the thing that you can put in, hair, hand, and then little thing. The little thing you can have in your hand and look at it through the day. So the chapters there are sort of like a best hits list. And you notice he's providing a lot of advice. Epictetus himself, he was a slave originally. He was born into slavery. And then he belonged to another guy who himself had been a slave, but had risen to become the secretary to Nero, the emperor, one of the bad emperors, unfortunately, who killed quite a few people, including Seneca. Eventually he's freed, starts teaching philosophy in Rome, and then gets kicked out. Why would he get kicked out of Rome, do you think? Any guesses? Moral turpitude, being a bad guy, drinking too much.
His ideas didn't match theirs.
Well, now you're on the right track. And it wasn't just him, though. There was a blanket thing kicking all the philosophers out of the city of Rome. Domitian, the emperor, didn't like philosophers. And the Romans were always a little skeptical about, what philosophy was going to do to their culture. So he kicked them all out, and Epictetus goes to Greece, and he settles in another place, and opens up a new school in Nicopolis, and he taught there until he died. And he lived a very simple life. Never married, fostered a kid who he took in. And he was quite influential. He was actually visited by another emperor who wanted to see, this great man for himself, the guy Hadrian, you might know from Hadrian's Wall, and that was that. And the Stoics, they had several key ideas in common with each other. So this is not just Epictetus, this is pretty much all of the Stoics. One of these is that virtue, moral virtue, determinate ways of being a good person, that's the good. That is what really makes a person good. That's what makes decisions good. And so what are the virtues? Who here has heard of, the virtues to begin with? Nobody? Only a few people? What are some of the virtues? Some of you may have had this in some sort of catechism class or something like that. What are good character traits? Yeah.
Rationality.
What's that?
Rationality.
Well, that wouldn't be a virtue for the Stoics.
For the Stoics, no.
Yeah.
For the Stoics, something like temperament.
Temperance, yeah. Well, now that's an old-fashioned word. It means moderation, control of your appetites. When you look at somebody, you're like, don't take that guy to the bar because he drinks too much. Every time you put a drink in front of him, he gets completely drunk. That's intemperance, right? Or don't take this person to the buffet because when they do, they can't control themselves and they stuff their face. That's also intemperance, right? Being able to control your bodily appetite so you can actually get other things done. That's important. You need that in order to succeed. What else do you need to succeed in life? Yeah.
Courage.
Very important. It's one thing to know what you ought to do. It's another thing to actually see it through. The Stoics viewed courage as dealing with fear, but also as dealing with your other emotions. Dealing with, for example, anger. It's not courageous to lose your temper and smack somebody in the face because they said something mean to you. It's actually courageous not to do that from the Stoic perspective. Our desires, being able to stand up against them. Dealing with pain. Do any of you work out routinely? You go to the gym? Do you always want to go to the gym? Do you want to go to the gym most days that you're in the gym? I sure as hell don't. But I do it. That's perseverance. That's part of the virtue of courage. Justice is another one. Wisdom or prudence is another one. The Stoics said that this is what makes a person good. This is what makes a life good. And then, correspondingly, what makes a life bad is the opposites of these. And everything else in between. Fame, fortune, wealth, pleasure, health. Those things are okay, but they're not the good. They're not really going to make you happy. And you may disagree with them. We just want to get clear about what they're actually saying. They called those things, strictly speaking, indifference, meaning that they don't make a difference to your happiness or not. That doesn't mean that they didn't think they don't matter at all, but they have a limited value. Another key idea that they had was what they called living in accordance with nature. This doesn't mean that they were all going camping all the time and hugging trees or something like that, or only eating natural food. I mean, pretty much all food was natural back then, in the sense that we talk about it today, because it wasn't quite so processed. What it means is figuring out what human nature fully developed really is, and trying to live in accordance with that, and also living in accordance with this universe that we're a part of, not expecting things to be different than they are. Here's a silly example, right? I take these keys out. What's going to happen when I drop them? Does anyone think they'll float? No? They're going to fall, right? That's a natural law. There's other things that are, not quite the same thing as physical laws, but you could call them psychological laws. And none of us are exceptions to those. If you make a bad decision, you will, sooner or later, reap the consequences of that bad decision. People make bad decisions all the time, thinking they're going to be an exception to the rule and they're going to escape it. Doesn't work that way. If you develop bad habits, you're going to become a slave to those bad habits. Understanding that allows you to live in accordance with nature. Another key thing, when you hear this word Stoic, how many of you, before you came in here, already had some sense of what it means to be Stoic? 1, 2, only a few people? Okay. So what do you associate the word Stoic with? Those of you in the back.
It would be how you act in accordance with things around you, so not letting certain things be to one extreme or one thing be too, lacking.
Okay, so moderate, you could say. Yeah. Go ahead.
Trying to overcome the struggles of life without going into some depressing feelings and living through life and going through those struggles with the head up high.
Okay, with a positive attitude, we would say. Do you think Stoics show emotions? No? Now, here I want to make a distinction between what we call lowercase s Stoicism and then uppercase S, Stoicism. So the ancient Stoics were not against emotions. And neither are modern Stoics with a capital S, people who follow the philosophy. They say that some emotions are bad for us, but not all emotions are. As a matter of fact, the Stoics think that we should live lives that are filled with joy and rational desire and taking, interestingly, one of the things they've been doing all this empirical research on what happens when you live like a Stoic, one of the personality traits that's associated with that, zest. It was a kind of strange result. It was the highest correlation. That means enjoying life. So Stoics are not joyless. They should feel love and affection towards people. But some other things, depression, anxiety, anger, these other emotions, they think that they don't serve a valuable purpose for us. And this is something else we can talk about later as well, because I know for many that's going to be a bit of a stretch. The way that Stoics thought you would become happy was through developing yourself, through something that we could call self-discipline or self-mastery. So let's jump in now to actually looking at Epictetus's Enchiridion. And one of the things that we should say is when we're talking about self-development or self-mastery or whatever other sort of words we want to tack on after the hyphen, we do in fact have to know what that self is, right? So what is your self? Who are you? I mean, I look around the room and I see a whole bunch of people, right? But really, mostly what I'm seeing are your clothes and your faces and your hands, because we cover up most of our body. Not suggesting anyone should take their clothes off, too, by the way. Perfectly fine with everyone wearing clothes all the time. But, we have your face and we have your outer apparel. That outer apparel, that's not you. You may feel that it expresses your personality, or it could be just, you woke up late and threw on whatever you could, right? That's the way I dress sometimes. But it's not you. As a matter of fact, even your bodily features are not really you, although the government, with all the tracking software, pretty soon will be identifying you with that, with the facial recognition software that's being used in some places. What is you? What's the core of your person? What stays the same over time? Or what changes deep inside of you and makes the changes that really count? I mean, you can change your appearance if you want. That doesn't make you a good person, does it? Doesn't make you happy for any lasting amount of time. People go and get makeovers, but that makes you happy for a little bit, but doesn't make you happy for long. What is a person? What do you think? I know what the Stoics think, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. What do you think? Yeah.
I think like your ethics, your morals, and your thoughts.
Okay. So your thoughts, that's definitely you. Your ethics and morals, I mean, you can see that as like the ways in which you make decisions, the values by which you guide yourself. I mean, Epictetus, I think, would go along with that. He calls what's most core within you, there's a Greek term for it, prohairesis, which literally means grasping one thing in advance or grasping one thing instead of another. Another way you could translate it, preference, or order of preferences. It's the part of you that makes decisions. Some people talk about this in terms of neuroscience as executive function, right? He also uses other terms. He talks about the governing or ruling faculty. That's the same thing. It's just viewed in a different light. Our rationality is also part of this. In your text that you have, the Enchiridion, prohairesis is translated in different ways depending on who's doing the translating. It can be translated as moral purpose, will, faculty of choice. It's the part of you that actually makes the decisions, whether you're realizing you're making a decision or not. And it determines what we do and think and feel. And here's where it gets really interesting. It can be determined by other things. So you could ask yourself, how the hell did I get here? You made some decisions, right? But your decisions were conditioned or determined by somebody else or some other factors outside. Or you could say you were programmed to respond in certain ways, right? That's all true. But there's also a part of yourself that can step back from the programming and say, I don't like this part of myself. I think this needs to change. Great example of this is when people have a string of bad relationships, one after the other. Are they just unlucky? Do they just wind up with the wrong kind of person, the wrong type? And it's just, so sad that they keep on, landing the same boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. What's the common element in those sorts of situations? You date a whole string of jerks. What's the common element? You. Yeah. There's something about the choices you're making that's leading to getting stuck with a bunch of losers over and over and over again. You could look at that part of yourself and say, oh, maybe I don't have to do things that way anymore. And you can do this across the board with all sorts of things. One thing that I wanted to say is, from the Stoic perspective, you're not special. That's the bad news, right? You're not special at all. The same things that apply to every other human being apply to you. You're not an exception to it. The good news about this is you're not special. That means that if you want to figure out how to make your life better, you can use the same sort of techniques and ideas that people have been applying for hundreds or sometimes thousands of years, because human nature has not fundamentally changed. You do matter. You are a person. You do have value, but you're not totally unique in the sense of being radically different from other people. You have the same sort of faculty of choice as Epictetus did. And the good news about this is, once you start to realize that, it gives you some room to maneuver. Now, why is this important from a leadership perspective? Those of you who are the business ethics students, why would it be important as an entrepreneur, or as somebody moving into management, or even somebody dealing with individual clients? Why is it important to understand who you are and how your mind works? Can you think of situations where that would be particularly valuable? This may not be something you thought of before. You may think that, you just go to school and learn some business principles and how to put together a plan and do your spreadsheets and all these sorts of things, and go out and start, making cold calls or developing leads. No, that's all great, but that won't make you succeed. Or you're going to train for HR and learn how to fill all these different forms out and comply with all these different regulations. That's good. That won't make you succeed. If you're running into snags over and over again, if you can't rule yourself, if you can't govern yourself, you're really not going to be successful. If you are, it'll just because you're lucky in that situation, and that won't last for very long. What allows people to become resilient is being able to control themselves, to understand themselves. And that's Stoicism is not the only way to do that, but Epictetus is offering you the tools for it right here in this Enchiridion document. Let's talk about another thing. Now we're getting a little bit more of a deep dive. Stoics call this the dichotomy of control. The text that you actually have here talks about it as being up to us. Some things are up to us, other things are not up to us. Could be translated as in our control, in our power, not in our control, not our power. It could even be translated as some things are our business, other things are none of our business. And notice the sort of things that Epictetus says are not in our control. Some of them are, you would probably agree with right off the bat. Is your reputation fundamentally in your control? Or can other people, in just an instant damage it? I mean, it's in your control to a certain extent. If you post all sorts of horrible stuff on Facebook or on Twitter, people are probably not going to like you, and they're going to say bad things about you. You can build your reputation, but all it takes is one screw-up, especially these days with social media, and you can become a meme, right? This has happened to people, I have a few memes. Fortunately, the people who do memes of my stuff like me, so nobody's put anything really horrible yet. But sooner or later, it's going to happen, with some picture or screenshot. What about your property? Things you own. Are those things totally in your control? Let's take your clothes, right? You're wearing your clothes right now. If somebody was going to come up to you and try to take them away from you, you probably could resist them, right? It's not like acid is going to drop from the ceiling and burn your clothes off or anything like that. But yeah, take them off and go to the laundromat and put them in the dryer and turn away for a couple minutes. Somebody can come right along and take that nice, sweatshirt, and you'll never see it again, right? And you may buy another one. It'll never be quite the same as that sweatshirt that you have right now. What about your body? What about health? What about your appearance? Those things, Epictetus says, are not fully within your control. I mean, there's aspects of our body that are clearly not in our control, right? Would any of you like to be taller or shorter, thinner, fatter? Have different, if you want to change your hair color, just go buy some dye, but that won't really make you that color, will it? You can buy contacts and you can do all sorts of things, but you're stuck with the body that you've got. I mean, trust me, as somebody who's pushing 50, I know the difference between old me and young me, who's now old me, and the me that I've got right now. No, that doesn't mean that you can't have any determination of that. Do I have a choice about how I eat or whether I exercise or whether I go to the doctor or not? Or it turns out one of the things we found out, in the last 10, 15 years, whether you brush your teeth or not is very important. Why? Because those bacteria can cause all sorts of other problems. Sure, but I could die from bird flu. I could be as healthy as I want to be and walk out. I live in the middle of Milwaukee, so I could walk across the street and then here comes the bus. And that's it for me, right? We can look at all sorts of things as being fundamentally out of our control. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't pay attention to them or take any care about them, but you should realize with every single one of those things that you don't actually have control over it. And we make ourselves anxious, angry, fearful, depressed, all these negative reactions by assuming that we have control over things that we actually don't. What do we actually have control over? If that's the case, we don't have control over those other things. What do you think we actually do have control over?
I do just want to ask, this probably isn't something that we have control over, but I guess I'm asking, whether it's grade school or whether you want to live on a college campus, they require you to have certain vaccinations. Would that be considered something that we don't have control over within our health?
So that's a good example of something where it's up to somebody else, right? So somebody made a policy and you don't have any control over whether they make the policy. You could decide, screw it, I'm not going to follow the policy, but then if they want to apply sanctions to you, you don't have control over that, right? And there's lots and lots of things like that in our life. A lot of people would like to not pay their taxes, for example. But, you can not pay your taxes, but sooner or later the IRS will catch up with you, and then they'll have a very bad conversation with you, which you might not like, right? So those are all examples of things that Epictetus would say, those are up to somebody else. They're not really up to us. The things that he says are in our control are our thoughts and actually our feelings and our desires and aversions, the things that are more core to who we are. Those are up to us. Those are within our power. You might say, well, how can I stop myself from feeling this feeling that I have, right? Well, you can't just snap your fingers and not feel that way. Think about a terrible breakup, or even worse, think about when you lose a job that you really enjoyed and you're in a bad economy, or you lose a client that you need for your starting business. That really hurts, right? And you can't make that not hurt right then, but you can determine what you do in terms of reaction to it. Do you go home and knock the bookshelf over and swear at people, or go out and, as we say, drown your sorrows? That's up to you, You can choose what you do. Do you take it out on employees, coworkers, friends? That's up to you. You can change your habits and your mindset so that you don't have so strong reactions to those things. That is within your control. Another thing that he talks about is prices and priorities for things. The top priority for a Stoic would be keeping the center of your very being, keeping who you are in accordance with nature and making progress and ultimately being a happy person. Not just happy once in a while, but consistently. To have what Epictetus called a smooth flow of life. Doesn't that sound good? Have your life going along without impediments. In chapter 38, he says that when you're walking around, you would be careful not to step on a nail, right? You wouldn't want to damage your foot. Now, some of you may be a little lackadaisical. I'm actually kind of clumsy. I break things all the time. But in general, we avoid physical problems, right? Why not do that with your mind? Why not do that with the core of who you are? Why allow that to be damaged? Because you value it less than you value your body. And that's, it's okay to realize that. The Stoics would say once you've realized that, then start changing your priorities. If you know that heading into certain situations stresses you the hell out, then start removing yourself from those situations or figuring out how you're going to deal with them productively. Don't just avoid them, pretend like they're not going to happen and then have to deal with it once you're stuck there. That's a way of changing your priorities. He also talks in chapter 12, and you're missing chapter 4 in this translation, but he talks about what do you do when negative things happen. And again, this has to do with your priorities. So he's talking about servants, right? A little oil gets spilled, a little bit of wine gets stolen. Imagine instead, now you're in the workplace. What are some things, all of you have worked, I'm sure, different jobs. What are the things that tick you off about your coworkers or bosses or customers? Really tick you off. Pet peeves. Bad attitudes. Okay, that's a really great one, right? Somebody comes in, customers can have bad attitudes. They're snotty with you. They want you to be, as we call it, Johnny on the spot and deal with their stuff right away. And you're like, I'm still dealing with another customer over here. They're very demanding. After you do what they want, they're still demanding. They're always trying to get something out of you. There's a couple ways you could look at that. Here's where you want to think about what your priorities are. Is your priority to have customers treat you the way that you want to be treated? Or is your priority to get through the workday? Or is your priority to provide good customer service, regardless of whether the customer is a jerk or not? Those are different priorities. Those are going to determine not just how you behave, but how you feel. And once you feel better about these sorts of exchanges, once you can sort of let things go, you're actually going to feel more free. And you're going to find that you have more energy and more ability to look at situations. So you have to ask yourself, is something worth getting upset about? If it is, it's because you've invested that thing with importance, and that's a choice on your part that you can unmake. We also make wrong inferences about who or what is valuable. He's got this great line. Some of you may have read this and responded to it. These sorts of arguments are invalid. I'm richer than you are, therefore I'm better than you. Don't we often say that? I mean, if we're being rational, we wouldn't say that, right? I mean, there is a thing that he says you can deduce from that. I am richer than you, therefore my possessions are better than yours. True, Somebody's got a nicer car than mine. They've got a nicer car than my car. But that doesn't actually mean that they're better than I am. He's got another one here. I am more eloquent than you, therefore I'm better than you. I can speak better than you can, therefore I'm better than you. Is that true? No. It could be that you are actually better than the other person, but there's no necessary connection between these. We make these sort of inferences over and over and over again automatically. We live in a culture that's constantly providing us with cues to see things this way. If you can break that habit, that will provide you with more freedom again. Another example that he talks about, and there's a handout that we'll be sending to you that we were going to have for this originally. It's how to deal with impressions of pleasure. He talks about this in chapter 34. So I'm just going to actually read this. When you receive an impression of a certain pleasure, be on your guard, just as you are with other impressions, lest you get carried away with it. Take your time with the thing. Wait a while. Next, call to mind both times. What times? The time when you will enjoy the pleasure, and the time when, after enjoying it, you will change your mind and scold yourself. Set against these the thought of how, if you abstain, you will rejoice and praise yourself. But if it still seems to be the proper occasion to indulge, if after you've thought it over you think it's good, then, how much better it will be to be conscious of yourself as having won the victory. So what he's saying there is, think through before you give in to stuff. When you're making decisions about what to do, where to place your time, where to place your money, where to place your effort, think about your ordering of priorities. Think about whether what you're doing is actually going to get you to where you want to be. And if you're tempted to go somewhere, that's a sign that you actually haven't got your priorities all figured out yet. And that's okay. That's a starting point. But now it's time to actually put them into perspective. You notice he talks about appearances or impressions there. That's another key Stoic idea. So, what are appearances? This is a really basic concept. Right now, I'm talking at you, right? And you're seeing me here. Those are appearances. Those are things that are impinging from without upon you. After I leave, if you remember me, you have memories of those appearances. Could be that I don't actually exist here. Could be that Matt set up a hologram and he was tricking you, and I never existed in the first place. He's just a super clever computer programmer. That's within the realm of possibility. None of you probably thought of that before you came in here. Now you're all, considering that, but dismissing the possibility probably, right? Everything that we do in life involves appearances or impressions. It's up to us whether we automatically assent to them, whether we automatically think that they're the way that they're presenting themselves. So I'll give you an example from years and years of teaching, right? It's after lunch. How many of you are a little bit tired right now? Nearly all the class, right? Maybe because you ate lunch, and now you're digesting it. So I can look out at the audience and be like, that person is not really that into this, And now what I've got is an appearance. And I can start reading things into the appearance, right? Maybe the talk isn't going that well. Maybe they have a bad attitude. And we can go on and on and on. And where we go wrong much of the time is in automatically reading all those things in, right? Those are judgments that we're making. We control what our judgments are, at least to some degree. It takes a little bit of practice to start getting used to that. But once you do it, you can start realizing just how many judgments you're constantly making. Now, would this have some application within, again, dealing with customers, clients, employees? Even thinking about larger scale things like looking at economic forecasts or how much you're bringing in terms of cash flow. You can look at how things are presenting themselves without making all these judgments about it, or at least just pausing for a moment. That's why Epictetus says, for every harsh appearance, stop and just sit with it for a second and say, you're only an appearance, you're not what you pretend to be necessarily. It could be that the thing that looks really bad really is bad, or it could be that you're reading too much into it. And so Stoicism would say that's very important to do. He also has another good line several times in here. He talks about people insulting us, and he says, it's not actually the person insulting us that hurts us. What is it that hurts us? Or it could be somebody smacking you, or destroying your property. It could be your arch rival in business, showing you up at the meeting with a better report than your own. deliberately to screw you over, right? The sort of things that we make into movies and TV shows. That doesn't really happen that much in real life as far as I can tell. People aren't quite so coordinated as that. You have, what seems to be happening. Then you have your judgment about it. Do you have a choice in how you look at somebody? Let's say somebody really is being insulting, Let's say you guys all came in here and I was like, let me tell you, I'm almost 50 years old and I have a PhD. You are just a bunch of young millennials. You don't know anything. If I was saying stuff like that, would you be a little bit off-put? Now, maybe I'm doing that because I'm having an aneurysm or something's going wrong in my brain, right? Or maybe I'm doing it because I'm a jerk and I want to stick it to you, right? I mean, right now we're imagining it and I'm doing this sort of stuff just to make a point. But let's say I was that guy, right? I'm going to lecture you. Nobody gets to ask any questions because you obviously don't have anything to say. We just go on and on like that. It would still be up to you how you want to approach that situation. You could say, wow, that guy's got some problems. Something's evidently gone wrong in his life. I guess he's not a very happy person, and I guess he doesn't really understand how to speak to audiences very well, right? Or you could say, I'm going to argue with him. I'm going to show him. That's not a productive strategy. Stoics would say, this is where you you can pick things up by one handle or by the other handle. Again, one of the points that Epictetus makes in there. The last thing that I want to hit on very quickly, and then we've got a little bit of time, actually only a very little bit of time for questions, emotions, affects, and attachments. So, like I said, the Stoics don't think that we should be unemotional. They do think that a lot of our emotions stem from judgments. If I get angry, and anger is one of the most complex of the emotions, it's because I judge that somebody is doing something wrong to me or to somebody else that I identify with, care about, am responsible for, or even something. Like if somebody's criticizing philosophy, I'm like, you're not going to criticize my field, That's me making a judgment. And if you can head off those judgments, or at least analyze them and examine them, you can be less angry. You can also be less sad. You can be less anxious, which also then frees you up for feeling the other emotions, which are, from the Stoic perspective, not only good to feel, but the sort of things that you ought to be feeling. There's rational amount of pleasure. We call that joy, and it takes a lot of different forms. There's a rational way to desire. They don't have a very good translation for that. It's usually translated as wish. But, when I told people I was getting excited to go to Stoicon, some of my, fellow people in the movement were like, Stoics don't get excited. That's a lack of control. And I was like, Stoics get excited. That's just rational desire for something that I'm anticipating as being a good thing. Even fear. Sometimes we ought to feel it, right? Rational amount of fear. Taking a new class with an unfamiliar professor who's got a reputation for being tough, would you feel a little sense of worry about whether you're going to do well in the class or not? Yeah. Should that lead you to going into their office hours, shaking like a leaf, trembly voice or something like that? You're having flashbacks? Yeah. We probably are too. That's not a rational amount of fear. And we could go much further with this. I want to leave a little bit of time. I know we're almost at the end of the time allotted, but I'll stick around if anybody's got any questions or comments, wants to go on further with this material. Yeah?
I wanted to ask, especially in discussion of rational emotions and virtue, Stoics are pretty similar to what Aristotle would say.
Some of the time.
Yeah.
Like on anger, Stoics, anger is always bad. Aristotle thinks that there's a good kind of anger.
Would you say that one of the main differences between Stoics and Aristotle is in that in Stoicism there is some sense of malevolence of the world, especially in some of them, like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, and Aristotle is more thinking of the world as being benevolent?
So the Stoics don't think that the world itself is malevolent. As a matter of fact, they think they're sort of more committed to this part of the world being a rational system that actually makes sense. But the people in the world, a lot of them are screwed up. And this is actually kind of a problem, for Stoics to explain exactly how that happens. But Marcus Aurelius has that famous start of Book 2 where he says, when you wake up in the morning, remind yourself that you're going to run into people who are ungrateful, conniving, just a bunch of lists of ways people are jerks. But the reason he tells himself that is so that he can deal with them as a good person. He doesn't have to he doesn't have to fall to their level and all that. But he's just reminding himself of the way people are. Aristotle has remarks like that, like in the Rhetoric, where he says that the audiences are almost always bad people. So it kind of varies where we're looking. Any other questions or comments quickly? I don't want to hold you over too long. I know you have other classes to get to.
Nice, an emotional thanks to our speaker. Very non-rational.
Yeah, keep it rational. Yeah.
What would that be?